Indie platformer might be a little stigmatic at this point in time. Since Cave Story and the following explosion of games released at the end of the 2000s and into the early 10s, the market of platformers coming out of small developers has been nearly constantly supplied. There are puzzle platformers, precision platformers, runners, run and guns, narratively focused, artistically focused, and my personal favorite, Metroidvanias. Almost all tastes in 2D games have a quality selection of platformer to suit their palette. I'm partial to Celeste and Hollow Knight myself. Of course, with increased attention on the genre, some larger studios would decide to dip their toe and perhaps revive a dormant franchise to minimize risk and upfront cost. In 2010, WayForward released a sequel to a Game Boy Color game, Shantae, Risky's Revenge, for iOS devices and the Nintendo DS. It was later ported to Windows in 2014, 3 months before the initial release of its sequel, Shantae and the Pirate's Curse. Clearly, it had performed well enough to warrant a sequel, and that sequel also performed extremely well. WayForward must have been in an excellent design groove during this period, to be performing so well with as much competition as there was, right? First of all, the game's presentation is infectious. The colors are vivid and the shapes are cartoony and bouncy. Animations share this bounciness too. The electronic Middle Eastern soundtrack is loud, catchy, and really captures the entire tone of the game. Shantae is dressed in a belly dancer outfit, so the emphasis on her poppy, energetic dance style is especially appropriate. The sound effects are also well defined and well produced. There are some oddities within the presentation of some areas of this game though. Places like Shantae's house aren't drawn in the game's pixel art resolution. Instead, they're scaled down to the correct resolution without alteration. They stick out as being misfitting pieces. There are also some bosses which have pixel art pieces that rotate, meaning that pixels will be displayed at unusual angles. These issues don't really affect the game as a whole, but when they are on screen they tend to be distracting. The Pirate's Curse is a Metroidvania in a peculiar way. The world isn't a single connected collection of areas like in other games of this style. Instead, it is segmented into islands that are traveled to via Risky's ship. These islands are then the interconnected map on a small scale. There are some positives to this. Environments that shouldn't be beside each other, like a desert and a tundra, can be progressed into each other, allowing for more visual variety sooner. Traveling from one area to another will never involve running through a superfluous area between them. Development time is somewhat decreased, since having to plan an entire world isn't necessary. But it definitely feels cheap. When Axiom Verge's intertwined world was put together on a shoestring budget, or V was written in a language that isn't suited to games, it creates questions as to why WayForward chose not to do this. And considering how Risky's Revenge did feature an interconnected world, it seems even more disappointing. Transitioning from one island to another isn't animated. Selecting which island the player wants to travel to is simply done via a menu, and the westernmost edge of every island is a dock, so the boat is always accessible. To wonder at the scale of these worlds is one of my favorite things about the Metroidvania genre, but the Pirate's Curse's world has less depth than Super Mario World had in 1990. All islands, excluding the starting island Scuttletown, are arranged in a similar way. Upon landing on a new island, Risky will tell Shantae there's a dungeon on the island and that Shantae needs to go and clear it. The player then runs through a few screens of platforming and enemies before the island's gimmick begins. Usually these are platforming challenges or require the player to travel to another island to find an item that wasn't accessible before. Upon completing these tasks, the player is then allowed to enter the dungeon, in which they find a power-up that is required to defeat a boss. On Saliva Island, some areas are inaccessible without causing a large creature to start drooling. With the changes the drool brings, the player is able to scale some statues to reach an item that opens the dungeon. On Spiderweb Island, Shantae finds a character from the previous game is injured and must carry her through a platforming gauntlet without the ability to attack or take damage. Once Rotty Tops is saved, the player is given an item that opens the door to the dungeon. Tan Line Island involves a subplot where a cult believes every female that enters their temple is their new princess, and that the player must escape the cult via some minor stealth mechanics and without weapons. The player is then given an item that opens the dungeon. Mud Bog Island and Frostbite Island require the item up front before the player can progress to the back half of the islands. The upgrades found within the dungeons are generally interesting. The gun isn't a particularly good weapon, but its puzzle applications are used creatively. The Slowfall hat is also used well. The downward pogo isn't particularly inspired and is never used as well as the gun. Super Metroid's speed booster is an upgrade which I think speaks for itself. And finally, the player is given a quadruple jump. Movement is an interesting subject when contemplating this game. Shantae's base movement speed is great, and the snappiness of the controls means that unavoidable hazards don't exist. This level of control is also present when jumping and falling. Typically, platformers will feature a coyote time to allow a little wiggle room when approaching edges and slightly mistiming a jump, but the Pirate's Curse does not have this. So sometimes the player will feel as though they just fell when they should have been able to jump. The Slowfall hat seems to slightly increase Shantae's upward momentum when deployed, and when used in conjunction with the additional jumps, the player is able to stay airborne for an especially long time. And the levels generally allow the player to do this, but it doesn't encourage it. Level design is the Pirate Curse's second major failing. Since the levels are intended to be travelled through forwards and backwards, they can never offer engaging platforming challenges. While Super Metroid is evidence that platforming challenges aren't excellent for running through multiple times, the world structure, the interconnectivity, and verticality more than makes up for it. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse just has long, flat levels with some platforms, so the game at least lives up to its most basic promise. There are rarely alternative routes. If there are, they lead to black magic or bypass the rare large terrain piece, which would involve some minor platforming to cross. Anything to alter the flatness of every island would have been great. It isn't until the end of Frostbite Island and the Pirate Master's Palace that there are any really interesting platforming scenarios at all. Frostbite Island eventually introduces some vertical levels and layers of platforming within the same screen, while the palace is the literal path to the final boss. It takes 6 hours to get there, dragging the player through the same bland, flat worlds over and over until the end of the penultimate island. When the player does reach the palace, it is just so refreshing to finally be asked to platform in a platform game. And when it ends, the player encounters the final boss and the game is over. The bosses are also a mixed bag. Of the 7, my favorite is the Steel Maggot. It has an interesting puzzle mechanic that involves using the projectiles launched by the additional jump power-up to press a sequence of buttons on its back before it's vulnerable to attack. Squid Baron is a good time, and the Pirate Master himself is a decent fight when he doesn't run away at the halfway point. The Ammo Baron is the first thing in the game, almost, so he's barely a boss at all. The Empress Spider barely attacks, and the Cyclops plant is eerily similar to Spore Spawn. Dargon is quite an unenjoyable encounter. Much like the speed booster power-up in Super Metroid, Shantae has to walk a distance before it can be activated. For Shantae, this distance is about a screen of uninterrupted walking in a single direction. Dargon is quite capable of preventing this from occurring, which can cause the fight to take much longer than it should. The speed boost is required to spawn 3 platforms, which land at random locations within the room. Dargon's head is the only attackable part of its body, and since he never sits still, it isn't an easy target to hit. Moreover, the tail breaks the platforms, so the player has a limited window to connect attacks to Dargon's head. The fight becomes tedious from being unable to activate the speed boost on command, but it isn't improved by reducing the window of effectiveness of finally getting the speed boost to activate. I had intended to comment on the game's length. According to Steam, I managed to see both endings just after 8 hours of playtime ticked over. In order to see the good ending, and to fight the Pirate Master's second phase, the player needs to collect 20 dark magic collectibles from various hidden locations throughout the levels. It would seem that I think that the game is too short. And it is, but I fear suggesting more content be added would involve another scavenger hunt through all of the old levels, and retreading those tired, bland areas again. This wouldn't be satisfactory to my intent. The finale comes too soon. Propeller Town should have been the cue to add more verticality, more challenging platforming. For a game that still costs 30 AUD, the total lack of a back half of the game is a huge problem. You can buy Ori and the Blind Forest for that price. You can buy Cuphead for that price. Celeste, Rain World, Hollow Knight's cheaper, Hue is cheaper. Way Forward really under-delivered with this release. Thanks for your time. I'll see you on the other side.